Hey, fellow G&Ters, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So we are in the middle of a series of episodes on Karma Mudra, uh, and that's one of the goals for 2025 to talk a lot about Karma Mudra, which is the use of sexuality and then ergo relationship, love in the spiritual path. And in doing that, we like to also talk a little bit about psychology around these different spiritual questions. And today, our goal is to talk about this thing called attachment theory. So the way we were looking at it is maybe just go over the general theory today, give you kind of like a overview of what it's about, and then ultimately we'll talk about how we think that applies to spiritual stuff like Buddhism and Taoism and all the other isms that we're interested in.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. And
yeah,
with the understanding that these are tangible these are tangible discussions, right? As we're talking about Karma Mudra and then, Karma Sutra, and we've been doing this series on attachment here. It's using the psychology of relationships in all the various forms to help illuminate different aspects of our life and of our own awareness.
yeah. I think that's been the big thing in like doing these episodes that we've been working on in the time we've been doing this podcast was it give a chance to pull together like more of the psychological stuff and the spiritual stuff, which is what we're trying to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
So give people different tools to work with.
Yeah.
So, I know, but this one's kind of funny. I'll go through kind of the idea of the theory, Daniel, and we'll talk, I guess, about the bits and pieces as we go. So,
Yeah.
full props. I'm using this book, Polysecure, is one of the starting places for this to give like
Yeah.
credit to the author. It's a lady named Jessica Fern.
Burn. Yeah.
I think she does a really good job of like just going over attachment theory overall.
Mhm.
She's doing it in the context of like polyamory, but I think anyone can read the book and get something out of it
Yeah.
because the greater part of it is really just about attachment theory, and there's parts that are about things that are like polyamory focused, but a lot of it really isn't. A lot of it's just, just
Yeah.
general stuff about love and relationships and attachment theory. And so I think it's good. Yeah.
Yeah, the book is unique in that it's broken up into like thirds, right? And the first third specifically is just on attachment theory, period. So like even if you only read the first third, it was well, I mean, I was doing some, you sent the notes over and I was looking up the book and reading some reviews of it and reading some snippets to it. And it's very positively reviewed across multiple spectrums, not just people who are in like a polyamorous community, but just in the psychological community, relationship discussion community in general. So
Yeah. So like, we like to use the word uniqueness for the poly folks. So
yeah,
it has like a unique, that's from Esther Perel, right?
yes,
It has this uniqueness vibe to it, but like big sections, even when it's talking about relationship advice and stuff, it's really like stuff that anybody could really use,
yeah,
not specifically poly stuff. So, and it's good book. So I want to give props to her, as being kind of one of the sources for this. She has some like charts and diagram things. I sent those over to you, Daniel. Probably what I'll do later on is I'll pop them up onto Instagram,
yeah,
right? For people who want to look at those things to kind of accompany the episode, So we'll talk it
yes,
through, but you can get the little visuals on that, you know. I'll do that probably tomorrow or something, but they'll be up, I'm sure, by the time the episode goes up.
yeah,
So, all right, like in doing this, I wanted to give a little bit of the background of the people who were responsible for this, just because we like to be educational
yeah,
on Jinn Tantra. So, the guy this is associated with is a guy named John Bowlby. I have like a psych degree. I mean, I must have heard of him, but he's not like a big name person like some of the other psychologists we talked about, but still a dude. And his big thing was partially being like a psychoanalyst and paying attention to like early life traumas and those kinds of things, which then got him into the area of looking more at this attachment theory idea. So still the idea of like things that happen to people early in life that affect their adult world. So
yeah,
like a
yeah,
Freud thing and stuff like that. But maybe in some ways, I think he was looking at it as a bit more concrete
mm,
and maybe even a little bit more like evolutionary psychology in a way, right?
hmm, hmm,
So he was kind of influenced by there's this thing you learn back in any psych class of like Conrad Lorenz, who's like you see the pictures and there's like a bunch of geese following this guy around,
oh yeah, 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 yeah,
and some Swedish guy or wherever he's from, I forget, but they're all following him. The whole point is like the ducks will imprint on the first
correct.
caretaker that it imprints on. So
That
he
is
kind of went like, yeah,
that is a premise of a movie called The Wild Robot, which I can recommend actually.
I never heard of the Wild Robot. When did that come out?
Maybe like October
Oh, it's out like
of
recent.
2024. Yeah, it's cute.
Who's in that one? Like very famous or?
it's a cartoon kind of movie, you know.
Oh, okay, okay.
But
I haven't heard of
it's
that.
totally cute and totally worthwhile if you have kids or you just like a nice, fun-hearted movie. But yeah, yeah, I won't go any further than that. But it's worth watching.
Okay, no spoilers, right?
Yeah,
No
yeah,
spoilers. Yeah.
no.
All right. So I haven't heard of it actually, which is funny,
Yeah,
but from my kids circle stuff. Anyway, so I think he was really affected by this idea. Like, look at those geese, for example.
yeah.
There must be some whole mechanism in living things that do this, right? So that was part of it. I think he also did some things. He's a British guy, and I think he comes from kind of a wealthy family too. So he sort of has an interesting backstory. Not to talk about all of it, but you know, he ended up working with troubled kids. And as he was working with troubled kids, he realized, like, well, a lot of these kids, as I trace back their history, seem to have these early life, what he would eventually call like attachment issues, right? Things went wrong with them and their primary caretakers. So that's sort of where he comes from with this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other person who's a big person on this is a woman named Mary Ainsworth. Give the props to the names of the people.
Yeah.
And she was a student of this Bowlby. She's kind of an interesting little backstory too, as far as attachment theory goes. She got married like in the 50s into the 60s, and she traveled around the world with her husband. And apparently she spent time like in different cultures looking at how they handled child rearing and then also how they handled like changes in the kid's life, like when you wean the kid off from breastfeeding and things
Mm.
like that. So she was just seeing different cultures, I guess, and thinking about these questions. So by the time that she was working with this Bowlby guy, John Bowlby, on attachment stuff, she had these different cross-cultural experiences.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting for our podcast too, because we think about, different cultures and how they handle stuff, obviously.
Mm.
I got an article, maybe I'll like dig it up for an episode we'll do in the future, but just about how weird American child rearing practices are relative to other cultures.
Yeah, and especially during the 1900s, really in the vast, and I'm not a child psychologist, or even a historian, but from a couple books that I've read, one of which was the one that we talked about, I think at the beginning of last year, which was Healing in a Toxic Culture, which
Oh,
is the
okay.
Gabor Mate book, and so he talks a lot about this in particular and the failures of the really like modern American psychologist Dr. Spock in particular, the kind of intentional he would call I mean Gabor would call it neglect, like
Yeah,
letting
yeah.
your kids cry it out, and like oh they'll you got to toughen them up. But like he gives example after example of traditional cultures where that is never the case because A, you're living in a communal setting. Your baby can't be crying. There's a lot of kids. You're not gonna let your kid cry all night because you're keeping your neighbor up. Now that we're kind of isolated, we feel like we could do that. But and we're gonna go, I'll come back to this over and over again throughout this conversation because it comes up so regularly, and maybe this will be a good lead in for where you're going to go soon, is that like the child doesn't have a fully regulated nervous system, and therefore it has to use its parents' nervous system to kind of moderate itself, number one, but then also to be that buffer between the external world and the home, right? At some point, they know that like there's an outside world as the child grows, obviously, right? I'm not talking about an infant, but that parent is there to do the regulation for the child that the child is unable to do, or let's say learning to do, maybe more specifically, right? And so when you allow somebody who doesn't have capabilities to soothe themselves, like get up and change their own diaper or go get themselves something to eat because they're hungry, you know, that they're kind of stuck in these states and not coming to their aid, you're leaving them in these places of discomfort for long periods, and they're wailing and wailing and wailing and wailing and wailing, they're going to do something cognitively in order to self-soothe. And you are going to go over a couple of those mechanisms here in a little bit. So we'll tease that
Well, I
just
mean,
like
that kind of language is there though, right? All that stuff about like self-soothing and
yeah,
like these kinds of things, that is attachment theory language, like for
yeah,
sure,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And how kids learn how to do that. And then, our goal is to kind of trace this partially into like what's useful for everybody. Like, how do you think about that in terms of how do you interact with people as an adult? And then
yes,
also like, what does this have to do with like things like spirituality and
hmm,
tantra and whatever?
yeah, yeah,
But like realistically speaking, if we're going to do these things in our culture, you're going to be dealing with people who have these issues,
Correct. Well,
right? Or we're going to have these issues and have to learn how to deal with them in ourselves so we can have spiritually edifying relationships with other people, right?
right. I mean, you're gonna have to figure it out within yourself, but then if you're in community with someone, which we all are in some way, shape, or form, that you're going to have to deal with it with someone else because they probably haven't dealt with it. Or and
Yeah,
if
I
not,
mean,
I'm not going to say probably, but they might not have, you
yeah.
know? So you're going to have to help them. And it's just, you don't have to help them, but it's going
I
to
mean,
be, it's a thing for sure.
yeah, so hence like presenting this as hopefully like a tool for people to be able to use, understand ourselves, understand potential partners,
Exactly.
understand spiritual partners, understand romantic partners, and
Understand
hopefully the
coworkers
combo of all of these. Coworkers too. Yeah, you're right.
because you're spending a lot of time. I mean, you're going to spend probably, if you're at a job for a long period, forget it. If you're at any job ever, you're going to spend more time with your coworkers than you probably are with your family, for sure.
Yeah.
So,
Like also like, I've been thinking a lot about like the tantric parenting angle too.
mm,
Like how do you raise kids to be Taoist, Buddhist, tantric
yeah,
in the cultural setting? And like that raises questions of like, how do you support kids and how do you develop these positive attachment things in kids?
yeah,
So
yeah,
as far as this Mary Ainsworth, the person who was the student of this John Bowlby,
yeah.
I was also interested because I just did a little research on these two people, didn't know too much about them. But the other part that was interesting from the attachment theory thing, and I don't know what she thought about this in the end, but apparently she went through like a vicious divorce
Hmm.
in like 1960,
Oh,
and
wow,
I
that's
started to
rare.
wonder, yeah, it was more rare back then, right? I think like, John Lennon famously the Beatles divorced in like 65 or 66 or something like that, but a huge deal, maybe a little bit later. But anyways, mid 60s ish, the whole Yoko Ono. And that's like, I think was shocking for people, right? That you get divorced, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know what this was like for her, but I just thought, well, that's ironic because, this lady who's studying attachment theory and, whatever went wrong in her relationship in her life, it was bad enough where they had to separate in that way, which, a
Mm.
lot of people wouldn't. So anyways, irony of the situation.
Sure.
But okay, so this Mary Ainsworth is the person who's really responsible for like the research side of this. We'll give the whole big picture of the whole big theory, and
Yeah,
it's a thing what they call the strange situation. And the strange situation experimental setup is it's really testing kids and their relationships with their caretakers. I think a lot of these were probably moms, but whoever the primary caretakers were for these kids in these studies. And the gist of the study would go, the kid would be there in a room where there was lots of stuff potentially to do that kids would like, toys and stuff to explore in the room.
sure.
There would be the caretaker, and then eventually a stranger would come into the room, and you would see how the kid would react under these different settings. Kid there, kid with the caretaker, the stranger, and then also what would happen when the kid was just left alone or when the kid was there with the stranger, and then especially what would happen when the kid was reunited with the caretaker. So it's sort of this playing around these different situations, right, with this kid. I suppose in psychology you call those variables. But in any case, psych research stuff, you'd go and you'd see how the kid would respond. And so they watched variations, again, especially how the kid handled exploring the room, how the kid interacted with the caretaker, and then how the kid felt secure or insecure in the situations where the kid might be either
Mm.
alone or with some stranger that they didn't know very well, right?
Mm. Hmm.
And in watching this, they came up with like initially three styles that they saw kids acting in. Eventually, going to end a fourth one, and then we'll try to trace that through to adult life, right? So we can see how maybe this impacts people in their adult lives. I don't know how you thought about with this, Daniel, but as I was looking at it, and I read the Jessica Fern book that I referenced in the beginning a bit ago, and I was like, this is interesting to think about because I definitely came from an environment that was promoting of like not a good attachment style, you know.
Hmm.
So we can all maybe think about ourselves too. We happen to be posting the podcast. I don't mind talking about my own experience with this because I can definitely say there were things that were off for sure, right?
Sure.
And everyone listening, we can all kind of like do the calculus in our own heads,
Yeah.
see how this was. But anyways, to describe the kids, so they really came up with like what was sort of a secure style of kids, and I'll get to that in a second. But they really talked about initially two kind of insecure styles, eventually three, where they thought, okay, there's something the kid is struggling with this, right? So one they called insecure avoidant. And it's kind of interesting when they describe it. It was kids who were very kind of like internally kind of contained. When you brought them into this environment that they didn't know, they really wouldn't explore it or interact with it very much. And that was true whether or not the parent or caretaker was there, right? The caregiver was there. The kid was still, avoidant and interacting with the environment. And even when the caretaker would leave, the kid wouldn't freak out or anything, but still would stay very much contained within themselves. And when the caretaker came back, they wouldn't even like reunite with the caretaker or necessarily reconnect.
Mm.
So kids who were very like they eventually used the term insecure avoidant. The weird part was the kids looked okay on the outside, but when you went to go like actually measure like indicators of stress, they were really super high stressed. Heart rate things. Eventually, they were looking at things like cortisol levels and stress
Mm.
hormones and things like that. So it
Hmm.
was sort of an interesting finding that the kids felt like stressed out. You wouldn't be able to tell from the outside, but when you actually looked at their stress response, it was there. And what was really happening with them was that they didn't seem to connect to their caretakers and they didn't seem to connect with the environment very well. So that's the first style of this.
So you would say that like the these are people who have maybe difficulty in new scenarios, new situations, unfamiliar surroundings.
Yeah, and I think also that there's something off with how they're bonded with their caretaker too, as part of the idea of this.
Sure. I guess
Yeah,
I was looking for more like as we grow, because people who are listening to this are going to think about this, but you can only go back so far in your mind, but you could
yeah,
think
yeah.
about now, these are, and I'm just thinking like if though it seems like it's the environment that is their bond with the person, but also the kind of like uneasiness with their surroundings also has
Yeah,
a
when you get to the
role.
adult version of this, they talk about this as being like avoidant or dismissive. So, we'll kind of get to the whole deal with it.
Yeah.
Um, Anyways, that's like version number one that would happen.
Yeah.
And then the other one they called insecure anxious. And these are kids who are kind of like clingy to the caregiver even before, the situation got a little bit more uncomfortable, before the stranger came in and all that. They were just clingy.
Hmm.
They wouldn't necessarily like explore the room either. And then when the caretaker would leave, the kids would like get really nervous, anxious. Some of them would just kind of freak out a little bit. And then the funny part was when the caretaker would return, they still wouldn't be able to reattach to the caretaker. So
Mm.
the person who was the primary care person would come back and they would either like still stay withdrawn and pulled away, or they would like seem to be like what they would describe as kind of like resentful of the caretaker person or something.
Sure. Yeah.
So they were very like emotionally kind of like a little bit more all over the place.
Yeah, you
So
could totally
that's
imagine like a young kid who's like mom has to leave the room or something or has to go away for a minute and then they she comes back after maybe a night out or whatever and the kid's like go away from me even though they
yeah,
were
just
like
like that.
hysterical when the mom left or the dad or whatever you know
Hmm.
and now they don't want to be touched.
And they're edgy in the way back. Yeah, yeah. So then the last of these they kind of added a little bit later on. And it was sort of a grad student of this Mary Ainsworth, a lady named Mary Main. I never heard of her before. But anyways, continuing the bio of the story. But
Yeah.
last one is they call insecure disorganized. And we'll kind of talk about like what kind of family situations tend to promote these different kinds of things in kids, because that's part of the idea too. But for this one, in like the general study thing, it was sort of like really confused behaviors from the kids, where some of the time it would seem like they wanted to withdraw from whoever the people were around them, the caretaker. Other times they would kind of approach and then like run away. Um, so they would approach and retreat. Sometimes they would just, withdraw and kind of freeze. Other times they might like even like hit the parent. It was like all over the place.
Mm.
So it was sort of like the last of these groups where the kids' behavior seemed like really chaotic.
Yeah.
And the weird part, there's a couple things that are interesting about this, I think. One part was they found that these kids had like the highest cortisol and stress hormone levels of
That was
all of
that
this
was
group.
that was going to be my guess.
Their behavior got super erratic, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when they were kind of putting together the idea of this whole notion of attachment, it was like they kind of got described as like having no stable approach. So the other ones at least are kind of stable. The kids will do repetitive behaviors. These are kind of like unstable all over the place.
Hmm.
And then the way they'll talk about it is that kid has come up with no like consistent strategy of trying to deal with this, that there's a sort of a chaoticness in this. and they have some ideas of like why this happens to kids. So, yeah. The last of these is secure attachment, and like this is just stuff that's good.
Right. Yeah.
So, all right, what are you going to say about them? But they kind of give a description. So, it's kids who were securely attached to the mother, and while the mother was present, they would go out and kind of like explore the room and kind of do their thing. And then when the parent or the mother or the caregiver would go away, they would get a little upset.
Yeah.
When the caretaker was there, they could interact with the stranger. When it was just them alone with the caretaker, or when alone with the stranger, or when the caregiver was kind of gone, they would be a little bit freaked out. But when the caretaker came back, they would be happy to see
That'd be better.
caretaker
Okay.
bond again. So kind of like the little geese, they go back to like the dude, and everything seems fine again.
This would be normal.
This would be kind of the secure attachment kind of thing. And it raises like some interesting questions that I think maybe we can throw around as the episode goes forward.
Sure.
But they kind of say there's like these different features of what attachment stuff is about. If we want to say it's a biological mechanism, or however you want to frame this,
Yeah.
one of it is like the proximity aspect they call proximity maintenance, that people want to be close to the people they're bonded with.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Another part of it was some separation distress, but the ability to kind of repair this afterwards, right? And how that'll affect people in their adult relationships. And then the other part was, which I think is really important for our psychospiritual stuff, was one, the idea of a safe haven, like a safe place to go back to. So even if you have some distress with separation, you can find your way back to this safe haven, and how that works for adult relationships too. And eventually we'll talk about psychospiritual ones, right? But to have that feeling of connection with someone could be kind of like a home base for you,
Mm.
a place where you feel secure. But then the other side of that, which they actually call like a secure base, is the idea that you have like some like home base, and you're comfortable going out and exploring the world from that. So for this Bowlby guy, he said basically there's kind of two instincts then. One is sort of the security instinct. I have some kind of safe space for myself, a safe haven. And the other part is like what he called like an exploratory set of instincts or something, that
Mm.
you want to go out into the world and move around and explore things. And so you sort of need both of those things, the safe haven and the secure base, right?
Mm.
And then the idea is like, how does this develop for kids? Do they develop like healthy versions of this, or does this not develop so healthy? And then you'll have trouble with like whether or not you feel like you can feel secure when you need to feel secure, but also you can feel free to go out in the world. There's kind of a yin yang to that too, isn't there? Right?
Yeah.
In yin
Yeah.
yang theory, like Chinese culture, right? Us being Chinese medical people, sometimes we do it like this too. The safe space, and then the yang aspect of like, I'm gonna go out and explore the world and like do stuff. So,
Yeah. It's
anyways,
like,
that's yeah. Go ahead.
it's like a kite, you know? Like if
Yeah,
you have a good grip on a kite, you can let it go up into the sky, quite far.
yeah, yeah.
But if you don't have a firm grip, the sky is going to win, you know?
It's funny. I was just listening to like these Stephen King books, and I was re-listening to like Pet Cemetery,
Oh.
and he uses like the image like the kite in that way. Like spoilers, but the book's been out since the fucking 80s. But it's not going to end well for this family. It's a Stephen King book, okay? But like the last happy moments he remembers, the main character in this, right? And I was listening to it as an audiobook, and if you like audiobooks, it's the guy who plays Dexter on the
Okay.
TV show, right?
Yeah.
The serial killer guy
Yeah, yeah.
who only kills bad people.
Of
So he
course.
does like the read for this book, but it's like he uses the kite as sort of that metaphor, right?
Yeah.
Stephen King does in the book, right? Like the father's teaching the son, like, hey, you can like hold on to the kite, but you can also let it go, and they're exploring that kind of thing. Like I just was listening to it like 2 weeks ago or something. He does the exact same thing with the kite.
Yeah.
Pet Cemetery. Yeah. Did you ever read any of those things when you were
No.
younger?
No.
Do you not like Stephen King, or you're like indifferent, don't care one way or the other, or don't
Yeah,
like it?
pretty much that one. Yeah, don't no, I don't really care.
Oh, you froze on me for a second. Did you like him or not like him? I didn't
No,
catch it.
no big deal.
You're not into it one way or the other.
Nah.
All right, I'm giving it a re-listen. So anyway, so two sets of mechanisms, right? One which is the more like yin one, and the one that's the more yang one, and then we'll look at it like in adulthood.
Yeah.
So maybe one of the other big ideas of this is like, how does this stuff happen? Like what goes wrong? And I think the idea with the attachment mechanism thing is like this thing kicks in when people feel stress,
Yeah,
whether you're an adult or a child. A child, of course, you're in that special role where you're kind of reliant on your adult caretakers. So, kind of what you're saying earlier, Daniel, it's a kind of a maybe a biological evolved thing
definitely.
or a psychospiritual thing, however you want to frame that, right? Where the kid is then, activates under duress or stress, anyways, but the kid is sort of learning these different techniques. One would be like, how do I make healthy attachment?
Hmm.
How do I connect with people? The other being like what you were talking about, sort of the self-regulating aspect of this, right?
Hmm.
How do I handle stressors and how do I learn how to handle that in myself?
Hmm.
And they use that kind of like phraseology of like self-soothing. If you feel more like secure, you can learn how to talk yourself down, even as a kid. You can use some of your own internal language with yourself and kind of learn how to handle your own emotions and your own
Hmm.
thoughts and still
Hmm.
feel good within yourself. Or that's one side. And then I think if you get really into the child psychology of it, you also learn something about what they call object constancy, which is this ability to like be able to know, like, okay, my this person I love isn't here now, but I'll see them again and I'm not going to feel so freaked out. Right. And then we get to adult stuff, which we're going to be going through in a second. But in the adult world, like, am I okay when my partner isn't there? Or does that freak my shit out?
Well,
You
yeah,
know,
it goes back to like, if I can put my own, like put it in a bow real quick. You have the external perspective and the internal perspective. External as in like you are regulating, not re, you're learning to be in communion with your environment. That's the barrier around you. And so how much can you attach to something versus how much can you let it go, right? As your protective layer around you, right? Like the pericardium protects the heart. But then you have
not
this,
use medical stuff, right?
yeah.
Pericardium
Well, I
protects
mean,
the
but
heart, protects the emotions. Yeah.
it protects emotion, but it's a cover on the Western anatomical, on your anatomical heart. The pericardium covers the heart.
Yeah. 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 Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, so you have this kind of barrier around you, and then on the internal perspective, it is your ability to, like you said, regulate, work with yourself. But if you don't have a place to do that in, meaning if your barrier is not strong enough, or we'll maybe say supple enough, maybe that's a better way of putting it. If it's not supple enough to give you the opportunity to do your own internal regulation, you're not going to be able to do that. And so there is this like very clear need of having, we can call it like healthy boundaries, which doesn't mean like impermeable. It means that you can open and close the door in order to let things in and out in a healthy way so that people can go and come back and you're not freaking your shit out the entire time. But that when they do go, if you do feel some way about it, whether it's your parents as a child or your partner as an adult, that you have the capability to in order to give yourself the opportunity to walk yourself through the steps of accepting, right? That the situation is temporary or maybe it's for the best or whatever the case might be. And the difference would be as a child or maybe as an infant or a toddler, you don't have the second part. You don't have the internal wherewithal to take yourself through it. And then simultaneously, if you're incapable of attaining what you require to fulfill your needs, i.e., diaper, food, uncomfortable, scared, whatever the case might be, you're not even going to have the opportunity to do the second one because you cannot allow yourself to be in a vulnerable state where you're doing some kind of self-reflection if you feel physically threatened.
I mean, I think like, like the idea is you have this like innate mechanism, right? That's going to kick in anyways, right?
Correct.
But you also have to learn how to like deal with it somehow. And if like kids aren't given the opportunity to learn because
Mm,
the situation isn't stable, however it's unstable, then you're not going to learn how to handle these things and you're going to develop
correct.
these negative patterns that you'll carry into adulthood or something, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
you're working with something really like deep. I was like in Chinese medicine, sometimes we use this word called the Po, which is like part of the spirit of the person that's the most vulnerable or something, right? Most
Yeah.
associated like feeling insecure, right?
Yeah, it's the part of the spirit that is associated with the physical body.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I've heard this talked about before in this way, so I'll share it now. So in Chinese medicine, there's like five, it's not a unified soul. It's like a rainbow in your spirit. Your spirit's not just one thing, it's multiple things. and they go from more material to less material, and the Poe is the most material of this part of the spirit. And because it's the most material, it has an innate knowledge of its own finite nature, and thereby letting go of anything is a reminder that it is that is eventually it's not going to cross over to the other side. Whereas like some other parts of your Shen that are dreaming or visionary or the most, I don't know, the most refined parts, they're going to be fine. They're going to get absorbed back into the great white light and and be part of the sky or wherever we're part of. But this part, the Poe, is like, yeah, but not me, guys. No, 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 no.
Kind of fucked,
I'm gonna
essentially.
be I'm gonna be worm food sooner than later. So,
Yeah.
I'm not letting go of anything ever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's like like sometimes I talk about with the metal phase and the Worsley school or something, right? This
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
attachment part. But it
Totally.
feels vulnerable or something, right? Like it has to do with like vulnerability. And this whole
Totally.
attachment thing is like how do you learn how to deal with like mechanisms of like vulnerability in yourself, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So on the different styles of how this can play out, then they kind of go like here's the different sort of parental situations, caretaking given situations that sort of tend to produce these kinds of patterns in kids, right?
Sure.
So, they talk about, the secure one, okay, well, that's just kind of obvious shit.
Right, fine.
You feel protected, you feel emotional, the parent feels emotionally available, they're responsive, they're attuned to your needs, and so on.
Yeah.
These other ones, something's going to go fishy. The avoidant one, um uh the situation, the way they describe it is like there's this attachment mechanism and the kid just can't get those needs met, and eventually the kid sort of like just gives up. So they still feel all of the stress inside, but they just aren't really even doing the behaviors that would reflect like, okay, I need attention, I need concern, I need love, I need whatever this is. The kid just has already given up. So they withdraw inside and they don't even really try to get that kind of behavior. The child sort of in a certain sense sees the situation as like hopeless and
Mm,
has already sort of like given up on getting this attachment needs kind of met.
mm,
And the idea is that the parental situations with this or the caregiving situations, whatever this is where people were sort of like unavailable, they weren't responsive, they weren't able to attune to the kid. They didn't sort of understand what the kid needed, so they were never able to sort of like meet the emotional needs of what the kid, required in the moment or something. The parent isn't able to do that, or maybe situations where the parent is just sort of rejecting. So all these kinds of things is supposed to like kind of turn, just turn the kid off, and the kid sort of gives up on some level, right?
hmm
It's interesting because I suppose like for a lot of us, if we look back, we can kind of go, okay, was that the kind of household I was from? And that's where I think this ends up being like psychospiritually useful for us, right? Get the idea of how the thing is supposed to work, but then go, okay, well, was that my situation? And you can kind of see whether or not you have these patterns in yourself in your adult life, right?
Yeah.
Um, I was listening to Jessica Fern stuff on this, and she had some additional little kind of like tidbits on what she thought were things that led kids to sort of develop these patterns, right? And so he said like parenting that was very like goal driven.
Mm,
Parents are only interacting with the kids to like, okay, we're going to educate you or we're going to learn some task or whatever. But it was all like goal driven. There weren't times when you're just bonding and bullshitting and whatever.
yeah.
I thought about that a lot with my son's 12 now, and we spend a certain amount of time like he's interested in chess. There's his chess shit behind us,
Yeah.
this little room. But we do that together. But other times we're just bullshitting around,
Yeah.
and we're just bullshitting. And I was like, that's important time,
Yes.
than just bullshitting time,
Yeah.
you know. And I realized like other parents I know don't like that stuff actually. They always think that there should be some scheduled activity, but a lot of times with us, it's just like, let's watch the highlights of the Lions lose to the Commanders, and he likes Jaden Daniels, the quarterback for the Commanders. This is when we're recording this
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because he has his like rookie card or something.
Yeah.
Like it's just bullshit, and it's fucking around and joking and whatever, right? And that's how you bond. I was thinking that's really important stuff.
Yeah,
So
I sometimes I feel like it might be, because we all have friends and whatnot who have kids. I think it's hard sometimes for people to relate. Like it's a struggle actually for parents to relate to their kids. And, I don't have any children, so I can't really say, but I don't know. I just this is what I get, you know. So it becomes a having things scheduled um is easier to do
Yeah.
than right. So on one level, and I'm not disparaging those who do that, you know what I'm saying? On the other hand, there is also a cultural, and we got to tie it in a little bit, right? There's a cultural pressure to be productive.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so this kind of pressure as an adult from your work then trickles down to the influence on your children. And
Yeah.
they have to be in this and you know all these things in order to create I don't know what they're trying to create particularly, you know, but they're trying to create something. And so when they're not involved in that, there has that muscle of connection between you and somebody who is significantly younger and has absolutely zero interest that you do. You have to relate to them. They're not going to
Yeah.
relate to you.
Yeah, she does talk about that. I laugh a little bit because it's true, right? Like sometimes there is that cultural pressure, and
Yeah.
then I don't know, it's interesting. It's like, okay, there's that weird Vivek Ramaswamy thing that came out a few weeks ago. I'm not going to talk about it too much,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
it was the whole thing of like productivity, 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 right?
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, like, I was prepping this lecture here, right?
Yeah.
And or this conversation we were going to have, but I was putting the notes, my side of the notes together. And I was like hanging out with my son in the afternoon, and we just have like our inside jokes, and we're just fucking around. And I was thinking, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. It's that. And as far as like having a label on stuff, it sort of helped because it was like, oh yeah, what am I trying to do with this kid now?
Yeah.
Goal driven in a way, but it's goal driven in a way like this is just our bullshit bonding time,
Yeah, totally.
right? And he's laughing and whatever. So yeah. She also does mention the idea of like bad fit where the parents don't seem to understand the kid. And you're bringing that point up too, right?
Yeah.
There's that bond. Maybe all parents can feel a little bit separated from the kids on some level,
Yeah.
right? But like, specifically where she brings up like, oh, this kid's so different. I don't get this kid.
Yeah.
You
It's
know, I'm
it's
really extroverted. This kid's super introverted. I don't get it. I'm super introverted. This kid's really all over the place and kind of wild. I don't get it. Yeah, stuff
yeah,
like that.
yeah, you have to be very engaged in their interests in order to genuinely connect with them. You have to, you know, come down to where they are. And some of this might relate back to like people's own childhood and maybe their parents didn't relate to them, which would be my guess, you know, because it is a skill, you know. And, you know, we talked about this on the previous episode that I did with Phaedra and it's going to be different. So I'm not sexualizing it, but she brought up the idea of compersion, you know,
Oh yeah, yeah,
having
yeah.
pleasure in seeing in someone else getting pleasure. Now, we were talking about it in terms of like, you know, probably a relational, you know, adult relationship type situation. But it really does lend itself to this conversation that you really have to be able to do that. So you have to get joy out of seeing your, in this case, your child, you know, enjoy themselves in whatever it
Right.
is that they're doing. And so it's a selfless kind of thing. And I think that might be difficult for some people. Not that they don't want to see their kid happy or whatever, but like you kind of have to bring yourself to see the world through their eyes and, you know, put those childlike lenses back on yourself and things might be a little bit more shiny, but you know, I digress.
Yeah, I mean, like something obviously goes wrong with this because the statistics go that like of the people who are in these insecure styles, it's like half the people.
Wow.
So it's like not a small, I mean, she was throwing that number out. We could kind of look at different statistics from different studies or something, but like a lot of time it goes wrong. So something is happening funny,
Was there
right?
a in that particular one, was there a I don't know, was there a questionnaire given to the parents that talked about their childhood rearing?
I mean, the theory goes that there's something went wrong for the parents that it went intergenerationally, but well, honestly, I don't know how all of that was put together, but
Okay.
that is part of the theory.
That would be my guess. That would be
Yeah,
my I mean, I would bet a
that makes
thousand percent.
sense. Yeah. So on the avoidant thing, though, I tried to go through and listen to like, you can kind of imagine what would make someone avoidant. If you can't get your needs met, you kind of just give up,
Yeah.
is the idea. But she had like these interesting little additional things like the goal-driven parenting. Overly strict parents was another example of something like this. And then the last thing she brought up, which I thought was really interesting, was like when the parent is like kind of like disconnected inside of themselves, where their outer expression doesn't seem to match their actual inner emotions.
Hmm.
And this like fucks with the kid's head that they can't like read what's actually going on with that parent. So
Hmm.
almost like the parent is smiling, but underneath they feel hostile or something or whatever. The behaviors don't fit together,
Right.
sort of more like troubled parents. And like I've always been interested in that idea. One of my psychologists I liked back when I was an undergrad learning all this stuff was a guy named Artie Lang, and he would talk about that mismatch in people,
Hmm.
incongruence, right? Where things don't fit together and how much it fucks with other people's heads, like adults, but even worse for kids, right?
Yeah. Well,
It's hard to manage that.
kids are even more sensitive than adults. They're far more in their feeling sensation, different
Mm.
brain waves they operate at. So they feel things much more deeply. And if you are presenting with one particular energy on the outside, but the inside one is not matching, they're going to visually recognize, a smile or a frown or whatever, but then they're going to feel something different. And that incongruence is going to be something that they're going to have to wrestle with in the moment, but that's kind of like a internal process that they might not have bandwidth for, so it's
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
be very off-putting.
Or they're learning something weird, like it just doesn't like the statistics don't add up or something of how this person's behaving, and it like
Yeah,
discombobulates them.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So on the anxious one, these are the kids who were, super nervous to begin with, and when the parent came back, they're kind of unconsolable, right?
yeah.
And the general idea of this one is pretty interesting. Like the whole idea is that the kids learn that, and I guess there's an irony or paradox in this on some level, but they sort of learn like, okay, my parent won't meet my needs, but if I turn up the volume really high, maybe they will. So if I just really make it obvious, like I'm in distress, if I really make it
Right,
obvious, maybe they'll respond to me.
right.
They learn some weird pattern like that. They kind of learn if they act out, they might get these needs met some of the time. So they call it like sort of like a hyperactiveness of this attachment system. It gets like super revved up. The person feels all kinds of anxiety inside. And, if they get into this, like, again, this kind of hyper revved up kind of a space, then maybe they'll get needs met. Something like that.
Called a tantrum.
Something like that. And so the parenting situation with this is sort of like parenting that's kind of like inconsistent in some ways. Sometimes the parent's there, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're available, sometimes they're not. The parents will put sort of they'll be maybe intrusive on the kids at times, right, and won't give the kids space, but other times they won't be there.
Hmm.
And especially the idea of like putting parental needs above the kids' needs, where the kid almost seems like they have to somehow like take care of the parent or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, that kind of role
I've talked with
reversal.
people about this. Yeah, this role reversal
Yes.
thing. I've talked with multiple people about this.
Yeah.
I felt some of this as a kid too, and we'll have to call it in a minute or two.
Yeah, for
Unfortunately,
sure.
we won't
Yeah,
be able
yeah,
to finish it. To be continued.
yeah.
But when we get to like the self-confessional part that we like to do on Gin and
Oh,
Tantra,
oh, oh. I'll wear, what is it? What are those little collars called again here, Eric?
the little priestly collars.
Yeah, that's right. Papal gear. I don't know what they're
Oh
called.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know the special name for it. But anyways, when we get to that part, because I think it's maybe something we can talk through, okay, here's how we can think about this. And, for each of us, if we want to do it, I don't mind doing it. So I
Yeah.
won't put you on the spot,
No,
but
it's all good.
I
I'll
don't
wear
mind doing it.
I'll wear my Roman collar, or they call it a
If they
clerical
call it the
collar.
Roman collar. All
Yes,
right.
I'll wear my Roman
Yeah.
collar, and we'll open
You're not
up the
gonna make me say
confessional.
like Hail Marys at the end of it and all that, because I
Just a
won't say
few,
them.
just a few.
I'm not gonna say them, bro. I never said them when I was like 8 years old in the confession with Monsignor O'Day. I'm not gonna say them now.
Okay.
Um, no, but because it was one of these things, and I could certainly feel like there was part of that with, like one of my primary care people growing up where I felt like, okay, I'm taking care of this person.
Yeah.
Um, so she has a couple interesting things, just I guess to wrap this one up and then we'll boogie. But
Yeah.
kids who have to meet the needs of the parents was a big one that she added. She said an interesting thing that I know you would appreciate, Daniel, which is just like overstimulation in general.
Yes.
That people feel like the environment is just overly stimulating, just period. And we live in
Yeah.
a culturally just overstimulating space, all kinds of stuff coming at people all the time, even to young kids, and it like overwhelms them on some level, right?
There is no doubt that amount of iPad time or tablet time or phone time on children is not detrimental. No one is going to convince me otherwise than that. I realize that like we are more and more a screen culture. You know what I'm saying? Like that's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we're at max capacity. However, the human attention span is only going down. And that is being reflected in the media that is also being created, which is, moving that along, that degradation along. And when you overstimulate people, it doesn't really give them the opportunity to regulate because they're expecting everything to be as quick as what they're used to being seen. So the mind is active, but the body is relaxed. But then the body can't be that relaxed if the mind is active. So there's always this kind of like interesting level of buzz that's occurring constantly. So yeah, I mean, kids are basically just like, yes, I know it's an obvious statement. Kids are young adults, but they're young adults in far more ways than just being uh previous to their older selves, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And like so I knew you would like that part, again, this is the Jessica Fern thing as we wrap the whole episode up, but she was just talking about that whole problem, and I thought, oh, this is definitely in Daniel's wheelhouse because you've been like, since the very first episodes we started doing these things, in the pandemic and all that, you were just like, yeah, this is like a major cultural problem,
Yeah.
right? You know, so yeah, so she talks about that. And then I guess the general gist is parents who can be hovering, invasive, or undermine sort of the independence of the kid
Yeah.
on some level, right? And they end
Very
up
popular now.
anxious and like they're not really quite sure how to get this emotional connection and attachment met. It's like an interesting take. And then eventually the response is just to turn up the amps up to 11 if you want to be like old school Spinal Tap stuff, if you get the reference.
Yeah.
Turn the amps up to 11 and maybe I'll get some attention out of this.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
there's the other part that kind of relationship for the parent is unhealthy. And it's unhealthy for the parent in terms of their romantic partnership, which maybe we can get to at a different point. But when you are so overly um, bonded or engaged with your child, you don't need your needs, sexually or physically or whatever, are being met because you're getting so much contact from this other being that it could be detrimental to your relationship outside of that with your child, And so without having, appropriate kind of like cool down time, if you will, you too can be overstimulated. Usually that's, new mothers in particular, but there's a lot of new mothers, and that can affect the dynamic between them and their partner. The partner can then be a little bit jealous of the child, and so you have these like, right, the complexes that then come into
It's all
play.
like Freudian shit then, right?
Right,
But
now you start to go into there, but that the Freudian ideology comes about as the mother's psychology of the bond between her and the infant. And so then everything else comes into, arises from
I
that.
guess, yeah, like previewing for next week and then we got to bounce. But, like
Yeah.
I know, like with my mom, there were definitely times where it was like, okay, her relationship with my dad is bad.
Yeah.
And I'm like the person who's providing this attachment needs for her, but this is awkward and weird. And, so to be continued, I suppose we can talk about these things honestly. But I've talked to a number of different, people that I know in their lives. And I thought, well, how common is this experience? And I definitely have had conversations even in the past year. Someone
Yeah.
I know was going back and like kind of doing psychology around their youth and
Mm-hmm.
seeing somebody. It was like, yeah, he felt very similar. I was like in this
Mm-hmm.
role of taking care of my mom all the time.
And imagine, imagine, Eric, if your parents had, one, both, or whatever, have a substance abuse issue,
She brings those things up too. Yeah.
you know? It's not to mention psychological, not to mention they were probably a child. They probably were the child that they are now raising because
Yeah.
that's how they know how to do it. And you were imprinted that by what you were given, genetically. So yeah, the cycle repeats itself. So the cycle of suffering must be broken. And the first way is to be aware of what's happening. And then you
Yeah,
can
it's
try
the
and,
knowledge part, right? Which is why
yeah,
we're doing the episode, right? Hopefully
you're
this
damn
speaks to
right.
people. You can start to go like, oh, maybe I got some of this stuff going on.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
to be continued, Daniel. Thanks
Yeah,
so
that's
much.
all. Yeah, as always, Eric. Thanks for doing this, audience. Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate you liking, commenting, and subscribing, or just subscribe. Really, it helps us out in the algorithm. It doesn't cost you anything. We don't ask anybody for any kind of donations or subscriptions or anything like that. But Sharing our work, subscribing definitely helps us grow, helps us to reach more people, and ultimately that is the goal. So yeah, share our stuff and appreciate it, all the input from everybody. Hit us up, ginandtantra@gmail.com, the Gin and Tantra podcast on Instagram, or if you know us personally, Daniel, Eric, we're on Facebook. Feel free to send us a message or leave a comment in this video. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.